The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
With President Biden trying to distract America from the disastrous stewardship of his Afghanistan withdrawal by laying out a 6-point COVID strategy, the Fourth Estate seems to have swallowed the distraction willingly, but not so the American people. The president's approval numbers are way down on everything from overall performance to dealing with the economy, immigration, and even COVID, especially now that it seems infection rates are up over 300% since last Labor Day. And the backdrop for this saga of a presidential crisis? The 20th anniversary of 9/11, a moment that changed not only the world, but the very way in which we live and behave. Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Today's show is a very special one. We'll be sitting down with Tim Donner to discuss the bookends of 9/11 and the Afghanistan withdrawal. Dave Patterson will be here to guide us through the madness that is the unspoken hostage situation at the hands of the Taliban. And we'll be delving into the big lie of Joe Biden as a jobs president and talking liberty with Scot D. Cosenza. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can get podcasts, breaking news and analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. We've got a lot to cover, so come along for the ride. All the truth with zero spin. It's been 20 long years since that fateful day in New York when the world as a whole first realized that we're not as safe as we once thought we were, that terror could enter our lives in the blink of an eye, and that our way of life may never be the same again. Have those scars begun to heal, or have recent events torn off the scab and made the feelings we had on that day afresh again? We're fortunate to be joined by longtime host of Liberty Nation Radio and senior political analyst for Liberty Nation, Mr. Tim Donner. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Thank you, Mark.
So, Tim, what state is the American psyche in? Have the people recovered from the wounds inflicted in New York City 20 years ago? Or have recent events brought back old memories and pains, and they're back to the surface?
Well, you know, I was in both places that were struck on September 11th, Mark, of course, because I live around Washington, and I had business and I have family in New York. And I was there that day. And one of the things that struck me the most was how people recognized immediately that the world would never be the same. They realized this was a point of demarcation, that the September 10th world had been left behind. The September 11th world was now with us, with all the things that implied, not the least of which was a massive Homeland Security operation, which has both protected and threatened our freedoms. I never saw the type of depression writ large among the American people that I saw after that event. My father, for example, was never a person prone to depression, as someone who always liked to laugh. Nobody laughed for weeks. Most people didn't smile for weeks. So it also, though, created a unity like never before, like one we have never seen since, like one that the pandemic should have created when we're fighting a common foe like this. But it created that on September 11th. And I would say that we have gone far enough past September 11th that it's easy to forget the abject terror that we all lived in. And so people do complain, and in many ways rightfully so, about the kind of liberties that have been taken from us through things like the Patriot Act that came after 9/11. But those wounds inflicted, those scars in New York will never go away.
Well, as you point out, there are two areas of time separated by the veil, or the demarcation, you call it, of 9/11, the time before and the time after. Now, Tim, you were, as you say, you were in New York that day, at the pivot point, as it were. Now, if you don't mind, can you tell us your experience of what happened on the ground and how things progressed to change from September 12th?
Well, I'll tell you, I had a story. Everybody's got a story from 9/11, but mine is one to beat the band, because I was in exactly the same spot as I had been on a previous unforgettable, life-changing occasion, world-changing occasion. I was in the Regency Hotel in New York City on November 22nd, 1963, when the waiter came to our table. I was having lunch with my grandparents and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, but the president has just been shot." And of course, the world changed from there. I happened to be staying in that same hotel on the night of September 10th and morning of September 11th. I woke up, heard that the towers had been hit, and realized I was standing at that point, Mark, about 100 feet from where I was sitting 38 years earlier on November 22nd, 1963, when JFK was shot. Now, of course, this sent a shiver up my spine, but there were unforgettable images that went along with this Twilight Zone type story, going to Madison Avenue on a Tuesday afternoon and seeing it empty. The hub, the very symbol of American commerce, Madison Avenue, emptied out with the smoldering ruins about a mile south of there. It was an image nobody will ever forget, and it will never be replicated, hopefully, in anybody's lifetime that we know now.
The Allied nations, they really rallied together to head into Afghanistan, almost as a way of trying to close the lid on 9/11. But that didn't happen. Instead, you might say that every day in what we call the graveyard of empires, Afghanistan was an extension of what happened. Now, has the way that President Biden ended the U.S. involvement over there, not that he ended it, but rather in the manner in which he ended it, has this exacerbated the 9/11 situation, or has it in some way helped close the chapter?
Well, you know, I said earlier that I never saw the type of unity that we had in this country as after 9/11. Never saw it before then, and certainly haven't seen it since, when we've become more divided than ever. A lot of people forget, but I will never forget the hug between bitter enemies, George W. Bush and Tom Daschle, on the floor of the House as Bush was making his speech about 11 days after 9/11. It was an extraordinary moment. Bush and Daschle hugging. We've seen nothing like that since. Equally extraordinary was the way that the world rallied around the United States in a way they hadn't probably, Mark, since World War II, after we helped save Europe and saved civilization. We hadn't seen anything like it, with America being rallied around by the rest of the world, sort of like we're all New Yorkers now. And we certainly haven't seen that since either. But they rushed into Afghanistan because they realized what was at stake, because Europe's a whole lot closer to Afghanistan than the United States is. And everybody felt extremely vulnerable after 9/11 because we didn't know how to react. It had never happened before. And so the natural thing was for all the allies to come together in a moment of unity for mutual defense against this threat, which we had no idea was as great as it turned out to be that day. But perhaps it also wasn't as great. Perhaps they got lucky with the World Trade Center attack.
The U.S. relationship with Afghanistan and the Taliban and other purveyors of terror from the Middle East, it's all gone back to square one, hasn't it? I mean, we're exactly where we were 20 years ago. Now,
well, yes.
Should we expect other elements of the pattern to repeat itself? That's the logical question, isn't it?
Well, I think the most frustrating part of this for people, even more than the withdrawal, looking back on this, because in the fullness of time, we'll see the 20 years of Afghanistan more than we'll see the withdrawal. I hope, because it's a stain on the nation, this withdrawal. But the fact that we got back the very same people that we spent, estimates vary, but maybe $2 trillion, over 2,000 lives, countless thousands wounded, thousands of Afghan lives, lives of others. For what? For this. I think that it's such a shameful episode in the way that the political class handled it through 4 presidents, the way each of them handled it. There was a lot of blame to go around. And I think that it's heartbreaking for people to look at the bookends. We went in to take out the Taliban, and we left being chased out by the very people that helped perpetrate 9/11. It's a mark of shame. It's a mark of tragedy. It's a mark of the utter futility of our foreign policy establishment over these last 20 years. I'd say that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was as apt a conclusion to this ugly episode as the Saigon rescue was to the Vietnam War.
Tim Donner, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
Now, don't go anywhere. Later in the show, we'll be discussing a major change in how jury trials work in Arizona in our special Talking Liberty segment. But before that, after this short break, we'll be back with Dave Patterson to figure out why the stranded folks in Afghanistan are hostages in all but name.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
And welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio. Now, the Taliban claims to have full control over Afghanistan, and this message is being propagated through the US media, but those who keep a keen eye on history may have been somewhat surprised to hear that the resistance operation in the Panjshir Valley north of Kabul was defeated so easily. Now, this is a region that held off the might of the British Empire, yet the media panhandlers lead us to believe that it fell overnight to a handful of ill-trained Taliban. So what's with the propaganda war taking place? Well, to help us get behind the spin and perhaps find a nugget or two of truth, we're joined by retired Air Force pilot and former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller, Mr. Dave Patterson, once again. Hi, Dave. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, Mark. Glad to be with you.
So tell me, I find it impossible to believe that the Panjshir Valley fell to the Taliban, destroying the last pocket of resistance in Afghanistan. Perhaps if they'd mobilized every single fighter they had. But this was allegedly a small operation that we're hearing about. What do you think the truth is?
Well, it is kind of hard to believe, actually. I mean, we are led to understand that the Taliban, in a single night, took on 8 provinces and totally subjugated them. That's a bit of a stretch. And you haven't heard that Ahmad Massoud has been captured, and that probably is a better barometer of what has actually taken place.
Now, Massoud is the present leader of what they're terming the resistance in the region, but he's also the son of the former resistance leader who faced off against the USSR, isn't he?
That's correct. He is the 32-year-old son of Ahmad Shah Massoud, and is quite popular, and he is reputed to be an excellent leader. And so I think that when you hear that he is in the Taliban's hands, then perhaps more of what they say is credible.
I think it's quite interesting linguistically that the Panjshir Valley is known as the Valley of the Lions, and Massoud was called the Lion. I think that's quite a fascinating connection there. Now, it seems to me that the Taliban have taken lessons from a range of social media strategists. Now, remember, these are mountain-dwelling fighters with very few special skills other than firing a range of weaponry. Yet they're using the social media platforms like pros. How is this possible? And is it possible that there's some foreign entity running their PR system?
Well, I think that it's possible that there is some influence from Russia and Chinese propagandists, but you have to remember that 5, 6, 7, and 8-year-olds are pretty adept at using social media as well. And keep in mind that 4 of those Taliban were, in fact, educated at Guantanamo.
Yeah, that you're referring to 4 of the people who are now forming the interim government who were released as part of a package deal for Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, I believe. Is that correct? That's right.
Obama administration released them, and we got back a traitor. Not a good trade.
A lot of people have that same view there, Dave. Now, we need to talk a little bit more about the public perception that's happening here. Now, clearly the Taliban are engaging in let's call it a war for hearts, minds, and wallets of the wider world. And hostage taking, it's frowned upon by the global community, yet we hear numerous reports of Americans and SIV holders having major issues still leaving the country. Now, are these poor folks, are they hostages in all but name? And more importantly, are our governments and the Taliban treating them as such? I mean, I believe you pointed out to me that Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that he had assurances from the Taliban that this wasn't the case, which beggars belief that some would believe those assurances.
Well, I think that one of the first comments that you made, that the global community takes a dim view of hostage taking, and that assumes that the Taliban is part of the global community, and I would take issue with that. They really are interested in the Taliban and Sharia law and implementing their rather strict approach to any number of societal norms. But I think, to your point, it is hostage taking by any other name. And quite frankly, the State Department has not shone brightly in this particular instance.
Now, it's prediction time for you, Dave, if I may. Senator Lindsey Graham recently told the BBC News, and I'll do a quote here for you: "We will be going back into Afghanistan. We'll have to because the threat will be so large," end quote. He then said that it will be just like going back again into Syria and Iraq. Now, we know there's zero appetite for war from the American people, but that's always the case with these types of skirmishes. Will President Biden recommit to sending in troops, do you think, or will it happen further down the line if it happens at all?
I don't think that the Biden administration and his national security team will commit to sending troops back to Afghanistan. I do think that they will try this over-the-horizon approach with drones and perhaps some tactical air. Will we have to go back at some point? Absolutely. Already you're seeing that ISIS-K, Al-Qaeda, and a host of other terrorist groups are starting to get a foothold in Afghanistan. And the only thing that might persuade them otherwise would be Russia and China, who do not want this to be a chaotic situation, even though it favors them in the long run. But eventually, we will have to go back in some form or fashion. And I think that Senator Graham is absolutely right. It will not happen with this administration, however. So the situation with regard to the building of terrorist organizations will continue, and it will continue at pace. And I believe that at some point it will be a real and palpable threat to the United States, but it will come probably in 3 or 3.5 years when this crowd leaves.
Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark. Always good to be with you.
Coming up soon on the show, we'll be looking at the new ruling in Arizona that means if you're in front of a jury, your life just got a whole lot harder. But next up, we're delving into the big lie about Joe Biden's job numbers. Don't touch that dial.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Heard across the Radio American network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. And this week, we offer a special thank you to those of you listening on KBKW 103.5 FM, the talk of Grays Harbor, Washington. With the latest reports on job gains being underwhelming by roughly 500,000 on estimates, President Biden's boast early this year that he'd overseen the greatest job creation of any president seems to be coming back to haunt him. While the president can certainly lay claim to initial job growth, there's a dirty little secret behind the numbers, and it's one very few in the media are willing to expose. Now, to root out the big lie in America's job numbers, we're joined by author and economics guru, Mr. Andrew Moran. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So the first question, it looks like the pandemic caused about 22 million job losses, and not all of those have come back. And I believe there's around 8 million fewer than there were before all this started. So why is Joe Biden getting a free pass on claiming to be the jobs president? Surely, if there were no president at all, no one steering the ship, the job rates would likely be the same as they are today, if not slightly better.
No, you're absolutely right. If President Biden just stood by, allowed the economy to reopen, you'd have all this job creation, no matter what he would have done, whether it was, no matter what policy he would have put forward. When it comes to why isn't he being called out as being the so-called jobs president? I think one of the issues that if you just look at the numbers on the surface, it shows, hey, jobs are going up. $250,000 new jobs last month, 1.05 million the previous month. So job creation is happening. It's just that when you dive beneath the numbers, which most people don't like doing, you see a far bearish view of the labor market. A lot of these jobs, as you said, they haven't come back yet. 22 million jobs are lost, but there's still about 8 million jobs gone. And also you have the issue of underemployment, which is I think that number is about 2.5 million, and underemployment, for those who aren't aware, that means your skills or your job experience or your education doesn't match the job that you're doing right now. So you have
and engineers serving McDonald's.
Yeah, exactly. And also you have part-time jobs still quite prevalent. Full-time employment hasn't come back yet. And one thing I find interesting too is if you look at the job creation happening, a lot of it has happened in the leisure and hospitality and government, which aside from government, that's not important at all. But leisure and hospitality, it does serve an important part of the economy. However, it doesn't produce wealth for the broader economy as a whole.
Yeah, I think the leisure and hospitality industry it's more subsistence economy for the people involved in working in it. Now, we can't talk about jobs without addressing I was going to say elephant in the room, but I think donkey in the room is probably a better fitting one there. Benefits. Now, is there any convincing evidence that the generous benefits paid out by the federal government during the pandemic have actually discouraged people from taking up work? Because it seems to be a very logical supposition, but there's a lot of poo-pooing and denying from various politicians and the media. What's the evidence?
Yeah, well, I've written about the data that does show the correlation between it. You just have to connect the dots. But also, if you look to the American people themselves, many of them have admitted that they've passed over jobs because of their sweetened unemployment benefits. So there was a study done recently by Morning Consult. It was done in end of July, beginning of August, and it found that nearly 2 million Americans admitted that they turned down job offers because of their sweetened UI benefits they received from either the federal or the state government. And the study overall found there were 3 chief reasons why people didn't take the jobs that they either applied for or they were offered. One of them was childcare obligations, which is a reasonable objection to finding a job. The other one was concerns over COVID, which I guess that's a reasonable objection. And then of course the higher $300 a week unemployment benefits. So even if you don't comb through the data, you don't crunch the numbers, you see the American people admitting that they're not taking the jobs. In the recovering jobs happening.
That's pretty compelling evidence, actually, Andrew. Thank you. Now, speaking of those benefits, there were 3 prime benefits that had come into place during the COVID pandemic. Now, all of those ended on Labor Day, so that they've really run their course. So now that those are over, are we likely to see, as you point out, these 2 million Americans, some of whom didn't want to take a job because of the sweetened package, are they likely to move back into the workforce?
Yeah, I think there's probably going to be a stampede of people trying to return to the workforce to take advantage of the higher benefits, the higher compensation. I recently saw a study that found the number of job ads showing, these massive benefits, compensation, all the perks you get from being employed, up 454%. So I think people, when they see that they're not getting any more government benefits, they're going to have to find a job, and they're going to see, oh, look, I can get $25 an hour to work at Dunkin' Donuts and have free donuts and free coffee and get paid just to attend an interview or paid just to sign on and be employed. But then, of course, when you have this injection of labor supply, these benefits are going to diminish because these companies are going to see, okay, people are applying for jobs again. I don't have to do this anymore. So this overheated labor market is going to diminish, but you're going to have an influx of new employees. Of course, on the other hand, if the Delta variant is a big concern and schools have to shut down again or return to virtual classrooms, then you still may have that issue of people having to stay home and look after their kids.
It's almost as though supply and demand is actually a thing, Andrew. How bizarre. Who would have thought it? So with this tsunami of people that will be returning, if possible, to the workforce, do you think that this will have a negative or a positive economic impact? Because I've seen studies from both sides. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, of course. More people employed, of course. That's always a good thing. The economics field, it's easy to dismiss the quote jobism when it comes to the labor market. A lot of current conservative or even libertarian economists, they as you say, poo-poo on jobism. It's sort of how can I put it? A lot of those in the ivory tower say job creation is fine and dandy, but what's more important is wealth creation and productivity as opposed to just the number of jobs. So, if you're able to create more wealth with less labor, then, that's also according to, let's say, Milton Friedman, which he made this case in, I think it was Capitalism and Freedom. I think that which is a great book, by the way. He discussed this very thing, that wealth production is far more important than the number of people sitting at a desk and, filling out paperwork to just collect a paycheck.
So is there no argument that the reduction of these benefits, so this taking out of the $300 a week plus the other two benefits that were coming in, that won't create an immediate negative impact on the economy?
Well, people are going to return to the workforce. They're going to start applying for jobs. They're going to get paychecks. They're going to start, participating in the economy. Also, the other thing too is that a lot of people dismiss the psychological impact of being unemployed. If you're jobless, you don't have much meaning in your life. Is that whether that's the sad state of affairs or not? That I'll leave that up to the philosophers. But overall, being employed is good for your mental health. You start engaging with the community. You start, going shopping again. You start, just being a normal human being as opposed to sitting on your sofa, getting a check from Uncle Sam and, playing your video games or eating Cheetos or whatever the case, unless you took advantage of that time and, started learning another language or getting a degree in something. But overall, it has a net positive impact on the economy, whether it's short-term or long-term, of getting rid of the benefits. And also too, with the inflation happening, if those $300 a week, I think that's what you're referring to, $300 a week in added benefits, that doesn't really take you very far anymore because of the 5.4% inflation rate and the 8% producer price hikes and the 3.8% PCE price index rising. So overall, those $300 a week is not going to take you very far if you want to stimulate the economy.
Okay, Andrew, you and I have spoken before about universal basic income. And it seems that several locations around the US, they're either trialing it now or discussing strategies for implementing it. Now, here's my question. Haven't we just had this grand scale experiment with the COVID benefit packages? For example, a moratorium on rent evictions and rentals, $300 benefit, other benefits coming in. Isn't this just showing us this is a real-time economic experiment, as I think you've pointed out, that shows people just don't work when they get free money?
Yeah, you're absolutely 100% correct. We said that in our last radio segment we did a few weeks ago, talking about that very thing. You have evidence showing that people, if they're just given money from the government, they're not going to apply for a job. They're not going to, do whatever it is that you normally do when you're employed, which takes money out of the economy, reduces the productivity happening in the United States. It decreases America's competitiveness on the global stage. So overall, the UBI is a lot of people say, oh, if we just tested it out, if we just had a phase. We just had a phase nationwide, and the results were not good. A lot of people didn't apply for the jobs. Florida had to got rid of the benefits early because people were not applying for those jobs that a lot of the companies needed labor for. So overall, the UBI is a terrible idea. We've had an experiment; it doesn't work. Just get rid of it already. Stop flirting with implementation of it. I think, however, regardless, it's going to happen. It's going to come into the United States. A lot of states are testing out. California just implemented a UBI for, I think it was pregnant women and people who just came out of foster homes. So, UBI is testing on the micro stage, but more states are going to adopt it no matter what. I mean, it's inevitable. Ontario, we had a UBI program happening in several jurisdictions in Ontario, and it ended prematurely, but a lot of the early numbers saying that people loved it. People loved having this free money, but of course, long term, it doesn't bode well for country's economic growth.
Andrew Moran, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right after this short break, we're talking liberty with Scot D. Cosenza. The Arizona Supreme Court ruled that potential jurors can't just be stricken. Racial justice or just a plan doomed to create even more problems? Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Now, something is afoot in the Arizona courts, and it's the first time that it's ever happened in these United States. Now, to delve into it, find out what's going on, what are the ramifications, we're joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scot D. Cosenza Esquire. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, Mark.
Now, Scott, I believe what's happening is that Arizona will be ending preemptory strikes in trials. What does this mean, and why is it so important?
So you'll have to dial me back if I get too inside baseball, but I'll lay it out for you. In any jury trial in the United States of America, previous to this rule change, attorneys would get a peremptory challenge and challenges for cause. So prospective jurors are made to take the stand and answer questions from both sides, whether this is a criminal jury or a civil jury. Both sides get to ask the jurors about their bias, whether they, for instance, maybe know one of the witnesses or parties to the litigation, items that may disqualify that juror for service or reveal some bias that then disqualifies them for service. And if they find that during their examination, the juror would be then stricken for cause upon motion by the attorney. Then there are just some people who you can't find that cause for, which is to say they don't know anybody, they haven't formed an opinion that they'll talk about on the stand or anything else, but there's just something not quite right about them. And you know that they're not going to be either a good juror generally or a good juror for your client. So for those people who you just don't like the cut of their jib, let's say, you can't put them in one of the 4 cause buckets, so they get into this peremptory challenge bucket. And that's gone away now in Arizona in both criminal and civil trials. The Arizona Supreme Court, who controls this rule, has tossed it out completely.
I think most people will be familiar with the idea of a peremptory challenge or a peremptory strike from watching the Derek Chauvin trial for the murder of George Floyd, where there was some contention over the jurors being binned, and there were claims that it was a racist act to remove certain jurors. Now, at the time, I believe you wrote about this and pointed out that it was perhaps a little ridiculous to make that assumption. But is this really the driving force behind why Arizona's doing this now?
So the impetus comes from, I think, initially a desire to help or protect especially Black defendants in criminal trials. There are other impetuses as well, but there was a Supreme Court case called Batson v. Kentucky, and in that case, a man who was tried by an all-white jury in Kentucky for a criminal charge argued that the prosecutor's dismissal of Blacks from the jury just because of their race violated his constitutional rights. And there was a Supreme Court case, I think it's 1986, called Batson v. Kentucky, where they established this rule that for the peremptory challenge, you're allowed, Mark, to strike a person for any reason or no reason, with one exception, which is the race reason. So you can dismiss any juror for the rest of the 49 states that still have peremptory challenges in all criminal and civil trials, Mark. attorneys in those cases can strike a person for any reason except for their race. Now, what happens, and what happened in the Derek Chauvin trial, is that once a juror is stricken who is black or a minority, the other side will often challenge that strike. Now, sometimes that challenge is born from a genuine belief, as you might imagine, that the strike was engaged in for an impermissible reason, namely race. But sometimes it's just done to frustrate the other party's choice of who they would like on the juror. So if, for instance, I was an attorney in a criminal trial, and my defendant was black, if I was a defense attorney, and the prosecution struck a black juror that I would want to keep on the jury, I might say, well, let's do a Batson hearing, okay, and let the prosecutor then explain to the judge the non-race-based reason that they have for dismissing this. Okay.
So that brings up two very important questions, I think, Scott. The first one is, if this Batson hearing is available, for example, to stop people deselecting a juror based on their race, and that's already the law of the land, then what's the point of this Arizona court move?
The Arizona court says that even with the Batson rule in effect, there is the stink of race-based selection for jurors, and they want to remove it in its entirety. And so that's why they've stricken it. Now, by the way, part of that is me inferring the reason why. Those are the stated reasons why legal scholars have argued for this. The Arizona Supreme Court, when they made the rule change, Mark, did not append an essay discussing their reasons why. They just changed the rule. Effective however many days out, no more peremptory challenges. But one of the things that I think is the unintended consequence is there are plenty of times when a black defendant or plaintiff, either a defendant in a criminal or civil case, or a plaintiff in a civil case, might find that there's a person on the jury without being meeting one of the for cause strikes, also doesn't bode well for their continued success in litigation. So plenty of times there will be a juror that a black defendant, their attorney would like to strike in a peremptory challenge, but those people are going to lose the opportunity to do so in Arizona. So I just want to make clear, it's not like this is a slam dunk for liberty and for anti-racist forces. It's up in the air as to who this is going to benefit and how.
Well, that leads me very nicely into the second thought that occurred to me, Scott. So is the Arizona Supreme Court, without actually putting anything in writing, admitting that juries are racially biased towards those who are defendants or plaintiffs, and therefore it would be logical for black juries to only try black defendants, to sit in judgment on black defendants, and white juries to sit in judgment on white defendants? Or am I talking judicial heresy here?
I think that's an interesting question, Mark. And one of the things that is interesting about it is, then wouldn't it make sense for black jurors, or rather black defendants or plaintiffs, to try to strike whites for the purpose of getting more blacks on the jury? And it seems like the answer is, by the way, there are scores of sociology departments and criminal justice studies departments that have looked into this. And I think what they would say is that there needs to be some critical mass of blacks on a jury pool, that when they're excluded entirely, as there are legions of stories, by the way, of this often occurs in small towns in the South where blacks have been discriminated against for generations and excluded from jury service. So there is this sort of legacy. I don't know if that legacy is present in Arizona. I'm not familiar with their racial history, but there is this legacy in many places in the United States of ongoing discrimination against especially blacks and especially on jurors. So it's important to kind of recognize that history exists, while also thinking, gee, is this solution going to be one that serves all people?
Scott, it seems that something may be wrong in the state of Arizona. Scot D. Cosenza, thank you very much. And that's about it for this week's episode of Liberty Nation Radio. I want to thank our guests, Tim Donner, Dave Patterson, Andrew Moran, and of course, Scott Cosenza, for being part of the team. And as always, I want to thank you, the listeners out there, coast to coast. I'd like to take a moment to remind you all that liberty is so rarely a natural occurrence. It must be planted like a seed, tended as a young sapling. And when it has become the mighty oak, we all need to play our role in ensuring it's not cut down. As Thomas Paine wrote, quote, "Those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must, like men, undergo the fatigues of supporting it." Well, in the end, we may find that one tree is not enough. You and I and all of us must together plant a forest that will feed rights and freedoms for centuries to come. My thanks to you for listening. Until next time.